The South Pacific in 1942 was a world of ceaseless rain, choking humidity, and jungle that swallowed everything in its path. On Guadalcanal, Marines dug into muddy foxholes while artillery shells rained down, and the drone of Japanese bombers echoed across the island. In the midst of this chaos, another battle was unfolding, not with rifles and bayonets, but with bulldozers, shovels, and sheer determination. U.S. Navy Construction Battalions, known simply as the Seabees, had arrived on Guadalcanal to carve an airfield out of swamp and thicket. Their task seemed impossible. Japanese commanders scoffed at the notion that sailors with shovels could create anything resembling a functional base. In Tokyo, intelligence officers dismissed the Americans as wasting time. A proper airfield, they believed, took months, if not years. But the Seabees had no months. They had days. As the rain hammered down, bulldozers growled forward, their steel blades biting into muck and coral. Men worked by lantern light at night, filling bomb craters, laying down steel matting, and dragging wrecked aircraft aside. Japanese artillery struck the half-finished runway, blowing holes in its surface, but by dawn the Seabees were back, repairing damage before the next wave of planes came screaming overhead. One Marine later recalled how surreal it felt. We were fighting in the jungle, and right beside us, these construction men just kept building. Shells fell, bombs dropped, but the bulldozers never stopped. Within a matter of days, fighter planes were landing and taking off from the runway. What the Japanese had ridiculed as a fantasy was suddenly a reality. Henderson Field, as it was named, became a lifeline, enabling American aircraft to strike Japanese convoys and defend the island from near-constant assault. Every sortie that thundered skyward was a direct product of Seabee labor, bought with sweat, danger, and defiance of enemy expectations. The irony was brutal for Japan. They had dismissed these men as nothing more than glorified laborers. Yet it was the Seabees who ensured the Marines on Guadalcanal did not stand alone. Japanese officers had imagined months of uncontested dominance. Instead, they faced fighters and bombers that rose from an airstrip built almost overnight. The work was grueling. Tropical heat combined with monsoon rains to rot clothing and skin. Malaria and dysentery swept through the camps. But the Seabees pressed on. They knew that every hour counted, every completed runway lengthened the odds of American survival. The sounds of war, the thump of artillery, the whistle of incoming bombs, the chatter of machine guns, blended with the roar of engines and the grinding of gears as construction continued, unbroken. What unfolded on Guadalcanal was more than an engineering triumph. It was a revelation. The Seabees had demonstrated that America possessed not just the will to fight, but the industrial ingenuity to bring the fight to the enemy's doorstep. Japan, which had banked on swift victories and on its enemies' logistical weaknesses, had underestimated a new kind of soldier. These men fought with rifles when necessary, but their true weapons were steel, timber, and machinery. The Seabees' motto, "We build, we fight," was not yet famous, but on Guadalcanal, it was being written in mud and blood. As fighter planes clawed into the air from Henderson Field, intercepting Japanese bombers and tearing into enemy supply ships, the contrast could not have been sharper. Japan had laughed at the idea of sailors wielding shovels. Now, those shovels had built the foundation of American air power in the Pacific. The battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. Japanese troops pressed in from the jungle, and the seas swarmed with enemy warships. But a turning point had begun, one paved by men who built runways under fire. The island campaign would reveal a truth that would echo across the Pacific War. Wherever the Seabees landed, American airfields and bases would rise, often faster than the enemy could comprehend. The runway in the jungle was only the beginning. What followed was the creation of an engineering force unlike anything the world had seen, one that would shape the outcome of the Pacific War. The story of the Seabees began not in the jungles of Guadalcanal, but in Washington, D.C., with a man who saw a problem the Navy had long ignored. Admiral Ben Moreel, the chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, recognized early in 1942 that America's strategy in the Pacific demanded something unprecedented. Civilian construction crews had already been sent overseas to build bases and facilities, but when Japanese aircraft and troops attacked, these men were defenseless. Under international law, unarmed civilians who resisted an enemy could be treated as guerrillas, executed rather than taken as prisoners of war. Morrill understood the Navy could not continue to risk unarmed laborers in combat zones. What was needed was a new kind of unit, men who could build airfields, piers, and bases, but also pick up rifles and defend their work. On March 5, 1942, the Navy officially established the Construction Battalions. Their nickname came quickly, Seabees, shortened to Seabees. Their motto captured the essence of their mission, Construmis Bitumis, we build, we fight. Recruitment focused not on fresh-faced youths, but on skilled tradesmen. The Navy scoured unions, shipyards, and construction companies, seeking men who knew how to pour concrete, drive piles, weld steel, or dynamite rock. Many were older than the average sailor, in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. Some were veterans of World War I who had returned to civilian life as electricians, carpenters, or heavy machine operators. Now, they were called back to serve in a way no one had ever imagined. A Seabee was not a polished parade ground sailor. He was a man with grease under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. Diaries and letters from early recruits often described the odd mix of boot camp life and technical instruction. One Seabee wrote home that they put a rifle in one hand and a wrench in the other. Training combined weapons drills with construction exercises. These were men expected to storm a beach under fire, secure the ground, and within hours begin laying the foundation for a base. The battalions were organized quickly, and by the end of 1942 more than 60,000 Seabees were in uniform. They were dispatched to every theater, from the steaming jungles of the Solomons to the frozen shores of Newfoundland. In the Pacific, where island hopping would dominate the strategy, their value was immediately clear. Japan could not be defeated without forward airfields and naval bases carved out of wilderness, coral atolls, and volcanic rock. The Seabees were the ones who would build them. Japanese intelligence initially dismissed the Seabees as non-combatants, mere construction crews in uniform. This miscalculation would cost them dearly. What Tokyo failed to grasp was that the Seabees represented the fusion of America's industrial workforce with its military might. These men carried Thompson submachine guns as readily as they carried welding torches. On Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and later at Iwo Jima, Seabees worked within rifle range of the enemy, sometimes trading fire while bulldozing landing strips. Their culture was distinct within the Navy. They were known for their rugged independence, for finding unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Commanders sometimes joked that Seabees did not ask for permission, they asked for materials. Scrap metal became bridges, wrecked enemy equipment was salvaged into usable parts, and airstrips rose where no airstrips should have been possible. Admiral Morrill's vision had created not just a new unit, but a new kind of warfare. The United States could now land Marines on an island and within days have an operational base to support them. Each Seabee battalion was, in effect, an armored workforce, engineers, carpenters, and mechanics who could fight as infantry until Marines secured the perimeter. By late 1942, the Japanese began to take notice. Reports described American bases springing up with startling speed, complete with piers, fuel tanks, and runways. The enemy had laughed at the notion of sailors with shovels, but they now faced a force that blurred the line between soldier and builder. The birth of the Seabees marked a turning point in America's war effort. In a global conflict defined by logistics, they embodied the fusion of construction and combat. They were not glamorous, and they rarely appeared in the headlines. Yet without them, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. The jungles of Guadalcanal had already shown what they could do. Soon, the Pacific would witness their full potential. Bases built under fire, airfields carved out of coral, and the foundations of victory laid by men who carried both rifles and blueprints. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The island's steaming jungles and treacherous swamps became the setting for one of the most critical campaigns of the Pacific War. At the heart of it all was a strip of land at Lunga Point, a half-finished Japanese airfield that would decide the fate of the South Pacific. When U.S. Marines stormed ashore and captured it, they renamed it Henderson Field, and with it began a desperate struggle for survival. For the Marines, possession of the airfield meant life. For the Japanese, denying its use became an obsession. And for the newly formed Seabees, Guadalcanal was their baptism of fire. The task was monumental. The Japanese had left behind bomb craters, wrecked equipment, and a jungle that seemed determined to swallow everything in vines and mud. Henderson Field had to be repaired, extended, and defended, all while under relentless bombardment. Japanese aircraft swept down daily from Rabaul, strafing bulldozers and blasting runways. At night, artillery shells and naval gunfire tore into the perimeter. Every dawn revealed a runway pocked with fresh craters. The Seabees and Marines worked side by side, often under fire. Bulldozers dragged away smoking wreckage as soon as bombs stopped falling. Men filled craters with sandbags, steel matting, and crushed coral, sometimes while the ground was still hot. One Marine later recalled, "The planes would land with steam rising off the runway, while the Seabees were still packing earth into the holes." The tempo was relentless. As soon as a strip was patched, dive bombers of the Cactus Air Force clawed into the sky, intercepting Japanese bombers and hammering enemy supply ships. The Seabees ensured that Henderson Field was never out of action for more than a few hours, no matter how fierce the assault. Japanese commanders scoffed at the notion that Americans could maintain an operational airfield under such conditions. Reports from Tokyo predicted that daily bombing and shelling would grind Henderson Field into uselessness. Yet reality told a different story. Each time the Japanese launched their dreaded Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs ferrying troops and supplies down the slot, Henderson's aircraft rose to meet them, sinking transports and isolating Japanese soldiers ashore. The Seabees' courage did not go unnoticed. Pilots landing on runways patched under fire often expressed awe at the speed and grit of the construction crews. One aviator wrote that it was like landing on a miracle every morning, a strip that had been bombed to hell the night before, yet somehow stood ready again. Conditions were brutal. The island's oppressive heat bred malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. Supplies were scarce. Rations often consisted of little more than rice and tinned meat. Yet the Seabees worked with whatever they could find. Wrecked Japanese equipment was salvaged and pressed into service. Scrap metal became makeshift repairs. Bulldozers became as vital to the battle as rifles and machine guns. The cost was high. Seabees were killed and wounded alongside Marines, sometimes while manning defensive positions against Japanese infantry attacks. They proved that they were not merely builders in uniform. They were fighters who carried rifles in one hand and shovels in the other. By November 1942, the Japanese mounted their heaviest assaults to retake Guadalcanal. Waves of bombers, artillery barges, and infantry thrusts pounded the American lines. Henderson Field should have collapsed under the weight of the onslaught. Instead, it remained operational, launching sorties that crippled Japanese reinforcements and supply runs. The endurance of the Seabees had turned the airfield into the linchpin of Allied resistance. Guadalcanal became the graveyard of Japanese ambitions in the South Pacific, and Henderson Field was the reason why. When the campaign finally ended in early 1943, American control of Guadalcanal was secure. The Seabees had not only proved their concept, they had validated Admiral Morill's vision. They could build under fire, keep vital infrastructure alive, and ensure that air power dominated the battlefield. Guadalcanal was more than a victory. It was a proving ground, both for the Marines who held the line and the Seabees who built the foundation for triumph. From that jungle airstrip, the legend of the Seabees spread across the Pacific. From Guadalcanal onward, the Seabees were no longer an experiment. They were indispensable. The United States had adopted a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified strongholds and seizing key positions that could serve as airfields and naval bases. Every leap forward required more than soldiers and sailors. It demanded engineers who could transform devastation into infrastructure. That task fell to the Seabees. At Tarawa in November 1943, the lesson was brutal. Marines waded through chest-deep surf, cut down by machine guns as their landing craft stalled on the coral reefs. When the battle ended, the atoll was a charred wasteland, barely large enough to hold the dead. Yet within days, Seabees went to work. They built wooden piers stretching into the lagoon, enabling supplies and reinforcements to flow despite the reef. Bulldozers cleared wreckage under sniper fire, carving out space for tents, fuel tanks, and makeshift runways. One Marine later recalled watching in disbelief as bulldozers were working before the smoke had even lifted. What seemed impossible to Japanese defenders, turning coral fragments into a base, became routine for the Seabees. The pace only accelerated. At Kwajalein in early 1944, Seabees landed in tandem with assault troops, constructing docks and barracks while Japanese resistance still flickered. On Saipan that summer, the stakes were even higher. The island lay within striking distance of Japan, and it would host airfields for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. The work was staggering in scale. Seabees blasted through volcanic rock and carved miles of runway capable of handling aircraft heavier and larger than anything yet seen in the Pacific. Day and night, the rumble of bulldozers mixed with the thunder of artillery. Civilians displaced by the fighting remembered the sound of machinery as constant as the ocean's surf, reshaping the island into a fortress. Then came Tinian, just a few miles from Saipan, where the Seabees achieved their greatest feat. Captured in July 1944, the island was transformed in record time into the largest airbase of the war. With remarkable precision, Seabees laid out runways in a parallel pattern across the island's flat terrain, a design still studied in modern military engineering. The North Field on Tinian would become the launching point for the most consequential missions of the war, the flights of the Enola Gay and Boxcar, which dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The irony was profound. Japanese commanders had dismissed the Seabees as little more than naval carpenters. Yet it was their handiwork that provided the platforms from which Japan's cities would be struck. Everywhere they went, improvisation was key. On atolls with no natural resources, Seabees ground coral into aggregate to make concrete. In jungles, they cut timber to shore up docks. On volcanic rock, they blasted with explosives, sometimes at great personal risk. Men often labored without rest, pouring fuel into generators while enemy shells fell around them. Diaries describe men collapsing in the mud, only to rise again when ordered. As one Seabee put it, "You didn't stop, because if you stopped, the planes couldn't fly." The casualties were real. At Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Seabees fought with rifles when Japanese infiltrators struck their positions. They endured the same tropical diseases, the same shortages of water and rations, as the combat troops they supported. Their insignia, the cartoon bee wielding a wrench, a hammer, and a machine gun, was no exaggeration. They were builders, but they were also fighters. By the spring of 1945, their reputation was secure. The Seabees had built over 100 airstrips, dozens of ports, and countless depots across the Pacific. Each base became a stepping stone, extending American reach closer to the Japanese home islands. What had begun at Guadalcanal as a desperate improvisation had matured into a vast logistical machine. The island-hopping campaign could not have succeeded without the engineers who followed the first waves ashore. The Seabees turned jungles, reefs, and volcanic plateaus into engines of war, proving again and again that nothing was beyond their reach. From Tarawa to Tinian, their legacy was written not in speeches but in steel matting, concrete runways, and piers jutting into blue lagoons. And as the Allies prepared for the final battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Seabees knew their toughest tests still lay ahead. Their bulldozers and cranes would soon roll into hell itself. The Seabees were more than men with shovels. Their true strength lay in the machines they brought with them, machines that turned swamps into airfields and reefs into harbors. To the Japanese, who relied on manual labor and primitive equipment, the sight was both bewildering and terrifying. A single bulldozer could accomplish in hours what hundreds of soldiers with picks and shovels could not complete in days. On beaches littered with wreckage and still echoing with gunfire, the growl of Caterpillar engines became as vital to American victory as the bark of rifles. Bulldozers became the icons of the Seabees. At Guadalcanal, a Seabee bulldozer famously dragged damaged aircraft off Henderson Field under artillery fire, allowing fighters to take off minutes later and intercept incoming bombers. At Tarawa, dozers pushed through wrecked landing craft to carve makeshift causeways into the lagoon. And at Iwo Jima, they flattened volcanic ash to keep transport planes moving even as Japanese shells cratered the strip again and again. These machines were not invincible, many were destroyed in battle. But more arrived, shipped in prefabricated sections, ready to be reassembled under fire. Cranes and dredges followed the bulldozers. With them, Seabees raised piers, seawalls, and oil storage tanks. Coral reefs that had once trapped landing craft were blasted and dredged into deep water channels. Floating cranes lifted cargo ships' supplies directly onto newly built docks. On Saipan and Guam, massive storage facilities rose within weeks, supplied by standardized steel and prefabricated timber shipped across the Pacific. A young sailor later recalled his astonishment. It was like watching a city spring out of the jungle overnight. Improvisation was as important as heavy machinery. Seabees developed a reputation for ingenuity in the field, often fashioning tools and spare parts from whatever lay at hand. On one atoll, a wrecked Japanese tank was stripped of its gun and converted into a towing vehicle. On another, Seabees welded together scrap metal from bombed ships to create makeshift barges. The battalions even built their own distilleries to produce fresh water from seawater when supplies ran short. These adaptations gave them resilience in places where supply lines were thin and every hour counted. Standardization and mass production underpinned their success. Prefabricated Quonset huts, simple corrugated steel shelters, became ubiquitous. Packed flat, shipped by the thousands, and assembled in hours, they served as barracks, hospitals, and command posts. Portable power plants, fuel pipelines, and pontoon barges were designed for modular use, ensuring Seabees could establish functioning bases anywhere. What looked chaotic to outsiders was in fact a carefully engineered system, an industrial war machine transplanted onto remote islands. Japanese officers dismissed these methods. In captured documents, they mocked the Americans' reliance on clumsy machines, believing the terrain of the Pacific would defeat such equipment. Yet every campaign proved them wrong. The very jungles, reefs, and volcanic ridges that the Japanese trusted to slow their enemies became staging grounds for Allied air and sea power, built and maintained by Seabee machinery. The scale was staggering. By war's end, Seabees had built more than 100 major airstrips, 400 piers, and countless roads, depots, and hospitals. They laid millions of square yards of steel matting to create runways, often within days of seizing an island. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was no boast. It was a reality seen from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. For the men who served, the machines became more than tools. They were lifelines. Diaries describe exhausted bulldozer operators working shifts that stretched into the night, headlights flickering through rain and smoke. One recalled the surreal sight of a bulldozer plowing through a burning supply dump, shoving wreckage aside so ammunition trucks could pass. The machine, he wrote, was worth more than a battalion of men. In the Pacific, engineering became strategy. With their bulldozers, cranes, and dredges, the Seabees embodied American industrial might carried across oceans. What Japanese officers had mocked as impossible became routine, and what seemed clumsy became decisive. The Seabees had proved that wars were not only won by guns and planes, but by the relentless machines and the men who drove them. That reshaped the battlefield itself. The Seabees were never intended to be frontline soldiers, yet the Pacific War often left them no choice. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was more than a phrase. It became a lived reality. At Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the line between engineer and infantryman blurred until it vanished. These men, who had arrived with bulldozers and welding torches, found themselves gripping rifles, manning machine guns, and fighting for their lives even as they laid down concrete runways and supply depots. On Saipan in June 1944, Seabees landed with the first assault waves, their heavy machinery following close behind. Japanese snipers targeted bulldozer operators, recognizing that every yard of cleared jungle meant another step toward an American airfield. One survivor recalled the sight of a dozer pushing forward despite bullet strikes pinging off its steel frame. Its driver hunched low but refusing to stop. Behind him, Marines advanced through the newly cleared path, sheltered by the courage of a man wielding earth-moving steel instead of a rifle. Iwo Jima proved even more brutal. The volcanic ash swallowed bulldozers' tracks, slowing progress to a crawl, while Japanese artillery zeroed in on every machine that moved. Still, the Seabees pressed on. Eyewitnesses describe men leaping from their dozers to grab carbines when enemy soldiers burst from hidden tunnels. Others kept their hands on their tools while shells exploded around them, determined to keep the airstrips open for the fighters and bombers that would save thousands of American lives. A Marine pilot later wrote that every time he landed safely on Iwo Jima's still-smoking strip, he knew he owed his life to the men who paved it in blood and sweat. Casualties were unavoidable. Nearly 300 Seabees were killed in action during the war, with hundreds more wounded. They fell to snipers, artillery, and even banzai charges. Yet their sacrifice carried weight far beyond their numbers. Every airfield they completed meant fighters intercepting enemy bombers. Every pier meant supplies reaching frontline troops. Every road meant tanks and artillery could move forward. Their losses bought momentum that carried the Allies island by island toward Japan itself. For the corpsmen attached to Seabee units, the battlefields were surreal. They treated wounds not only from bullets, but from flying shrapnel that tore through engineers working cranes and cement mixers. Diaries described men patching each other up in the dust of Saipan's beaches, then returning to their bulldozers before the bandages were dry. In these moments, the Seabees showed the same resilience as the Marines at their side, the will to finish the job, no matter the cost. Japanese commanders had once dismissed the idea of sailors with shovels, but by 1944, they viewed the Seabees as a threat equal to any combat division. Not only could these men build bases under fire, they could defend them fiercely. Reports from Japanese survivors spoke of frustration as machine gun nests manned by Seabees held their ground, while runways they thought destroyed were restored overnight. The engineers were no longer a background force. They were dangerous enemies who embodied the relentless American advance. The Seabees' combat record blurred military categories. They were not infantry, yet they fought. They were not engineers in the traditional sense, yet their projects carried the weight of strategy. Their dual identity made them indispensable. In the Pacific, a bulldozer blade and a rifle stock were equally tools of war. By the end of the conflict, the cost was evident in memorials and casualty lists. But so too was the achievement. Bases carved from coral and volcanic rock, built and defended by men who carried both wrenches and weapons. The Japanese had mocked them at first. By war's end, no one laughed. The Seabees had proven that in modern war, concrete and courage could be poured in the same mold and hardened in blood. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the battle-scarred Pacific bore the unmistakable imprint of the Seabees. From Guadalcanal's muddy clearings to the vast airfields of Tinian and Guam, their work remained. Concrete runways, steel piers, and entire bases carved out of jungle and coral. In just 3.5 years, more than 325,000 men had donned the patch of the Construction Battalions. Together, they built over 400 advanced bases, 100 airstrips, and thousands of miles of roads, pipelines, and housing that allowed the U.S. military to sustain operations across half the globe. What began as an experiment in 1942 had become one of the most decisive tools of modern warfare. Without the Seabees, the island-hopping strategy that carried the Allies from the Solomons to the Marianas would have collapsed under its own logistical weight. B-29 bombers could not have launched their missions without the vast airfields of Saipan and Tinian. Amphibious fleets could not have resupplied without the harbors and docks built under fire. Marines and soldiers would have been stranded without roads, hospitals, and depots to support them. One admiral later remarked that the Seabees had shortened the war by months, perhaps years, through their speed and ingenuity. Their sacrifices were etched into this legacy. Nearly 300 Seabees were killed in action during the war, with many more wounded. They had been promised that their role was to build, but the Pacific demanded they also fight. The motto, "We build, we fight," became their truth, and their dual identity ensured that their work could not be undone by the enemy. After the war, the Seabees did not fade away. They were retained as a permanent part of the U.S. Navy, recognized as an indispensable arm of military power. In Korea, they carved roads through frozen mountains. In Vietnam, they built bases in swamps and jungles. In peacetime, their bulldozers and cranes turned to disaster relief and humanitarian aid, schools in remote villages, hospitals in war-torn regions, and shelters in the aftermath of natural disasters. The same hands that once laid runways for bombers now poured foundations for peace. Their story carries a deep irony. In 1942, Japanese officers had mocked the idea of sailors with shovels, certain that engineers could never withstand the crucible of combat. Yet it was the Seabees runways that enabled American fighters to hold Guadalcanal. It was their harbors that fueled the fleets pressing toward the Marianas. It was their roads and depots that brought the U.S. Army and Marine Corps to the gates of Japan itself. By the time Tokyo lay in ruins, those sailors with shovels had proven to be as dangerous to Japan's empire as any battleship or carrier. The men themselves remained humble. Many returned home to resume ordinary lives as carpenters, miners, or machinists. But their wartime service left an indelible mark. They knew they had been part of something larger, not just building structures, but building victory. As one veteran later reflected, "We weren't heroes with rifles, but every nail, every beam, every runway, it all pointed toward Tokyo." Today, their legacy lives on in the motto and mission of the U.S. Navy Seabees, whose emblem still bears the fighting bee gripping tools and weapons alike. Their story is taught not only as military history, but as a lesson in resilience, ingenuity, and the power of ordinary men rising to extraordinary demands. The closing image is unmistakable: a jungle clearing in the South Pacific, the air heavy with heat and rain. Bulldozers push through mud, cranes swing steel beams into place, and within days, the thunder of aircraft echoes over freshly laid runways. What began as laughter from their enemies ended as silence, the silence of conquered skies and defeated fleets. The Seabees had proven that wars are not only won by those who fight, but by those who build. And in the crucible of World War II, they built the very foundations of victory.